The splintered oak wheel of the buckboard wagon gave way with a sickening crack, pitching 22-year-old Abigail Vance sideways into the sharp red dirt of a dry gulch. The panicked mule kicked wildly in its harness, spraying gravel as a rattle from the sagebrush signaled an angry diamondback taking strike position just inches from Abby's pinned ankle. Dust choked her throat, and her bruised shoulder throbbed where it had absorbed the brunt of the impact. The vast, empty horizon of North Texas stretched around her like an open furnace. No water, no passerby, and a sun dropping fast behind the jagged teeth of Rattlesnake Ridge. In the silence of the wilderness, survival wasn't a promise. It was a daily negotiation. Slowly, deliberately keeping her heavy breath tucked deep within her chest, Abby reached down and hauled her round, dust-caked frame upward with the fierce, unyielding strength hidden beneath her soft exterior. She grabbed a heavy cedar fence post lying nearby and jammed it between the rattlesnake and her boot, driving the reptile back into the brush before it could strike. She didn't scream, and she didn't weep. Life had already stripped her of the luxury of panic. It was October 1888, and the Texas Panhandle air carried the dry iron smell of pending frost. Abby was not the kind of woman folks in town wrote poems about. She was heavy-set, broad-shouldered, and carried herself with the hesitant, slouched posture of someone who had spent her youth being told she took up entirely too much room. But beneath that quiet, timid shell lay a resilient, stubborn endurance. 6 months earlier, a sudden, merciless tornado had torn through her family's home on the outskirts of St. Louis, burying her mother and father under the splintered ruins of their timber barn. Abby had survived only because she had been down in the storm cellar, pulling up jars of preserved peaches. When the wind stopped roaring, she was left with nothing but an aching emptiness in her chest, a trunk of hand-me-down dresses and a piece of stiff yellowed leather handed to her by her father's probate attorney. It was her grandfather's will, drafted in 1865, bequeathing 80 acres of rocky, lime-heavy Texas pasture and a sagging white house to whomever among my blood possesses the silence to listen to what the ground is trying to say. Her older brother had left, declaring the land a dust trap, and remained in St. Louis to work the rail yards. Abby, possessing nowhere else to go and carrying a grief too heavy for city streets, packed her canvas bag, boarded a westbound train, and rode the final 40 miles into the rugged expanse of Oak Haven. The town of Oak Haven was not welcoming to a lonely, overweight city girl. The local shopkeepers watched her shuffle into the feed store in her oversized wool coat and worn boots, whispering behind their hands. The Old West was built by lean, leather-skinned men and sharp-featured pioneer women. Abby looked like a soft loaf of bread dropped into a briar patch. Her only living kin on the property was her great-aunt Merle. At 79, Aunt Merle was the polar opposite of Abby, thin as a willow whip, her skin cured like saddle leather from 7 decades of Texas sun. Merle wore a pair of her late brother's canvas trousers, rubber boots, and a heavy Colt revolver strapped low on her hip. She lived in a 2-room log cabin on the far corner of the ridge. When Abby arrived, Merle offered no tearful embrace. She simply handed Abby an iron skillet pointed to the brass pump handle in the yard and said, "The well is 90 feet deep. The water is sweet, but you'll have to earn every single gallon." The morning of the autumn livestock auction at the county fairgrounds, a bitter wind cut through the timber barns. Abby stood near the back rail of the auction ring, her hands shoved deep into her coat pockets to hide their nervous trembling. The pens were packed with lean steers, wire-haired goats, and half-wild horses. But back behind the main barn, stacked 5 high in rusted wire crates, sat 300 commercial-laying hens. They were a tragic sight. Their feathers were stripped bare along their backs from months in crowded wire cages. Their combs were pale, shriveled, and dusty, and their eyes were dull, half-lidded with utter exhaustion. A commercial egg outfit from the east had dumped them off at cost rather than pay the freight to the rendering plant. The auctioneer cleared his throat, eager to move past the lot. "Got 300 spent layers here, folks. Do I hear $1 a crate, 50 cents? The crowd stood silent. Leaning against the wooden railing was Clayton Carver, the wealthiest cattle rancher in the valley. A tall, booming man with silver spurs and a mustache that hid his thin lips. Clayton spat a stream of black tobacco juice into the dirt and laughed aloud. "Only thing those pathetic birds are good for is teaching a young bird dog how to point," Clayton called out, his voice echoing across the barn. "They're finished. They'll be dead before the first snow hits the ridge." The men around him chuckled, the easy, cruel laugh of people accustomed to agreeing with a powerful man. The auctioneer sighed, preparing to write the lot off as a total loss. Flat price for the lot then, $10.05. Abby looked at those birds. Through the wire mesh, she saw their tiny chests rising and falling in rapid, terrified panting. She saw the way they huddled together, broken, discarded, and written off by a world that valued only what was young, sleek, and immediately profitable. A sharp ache rose in her throat, a sudden, overwhelming recognition. They are like me, she thought, left behind. Before her fear could stop her, Abby raised one thick, gloved finger. $15, her voice quavered. It wasn't loud, but it carried clearly across the quiet morning air. The auctioneer's gavel came down with a sharp crack. Sold to the young lady in the back for $15. Clayton Carver turned his cold gray eyes, sweeping over Abby's round figure and ill-fitting coat. He shook his head with a sneer. Well, plain as weather, he said loud enough for half the town to hear. That heavy girl just paid $15 for the privilege of digging 300 holes in Texas limestone. The crowd erupted in laughter. Abby didn't say a word. Her face burned hot, but she kept her eyes fixed straight ahead. She walked past Clayton, her chin held high, and began hauling the heavy crates toward her rented buckboard wagon, counting the quiet, fragile breaths of the 300 lives she had just claimed. She knew the hard work was only beginning, and as the clouds gathered dark over the western hills, she knew the land and the brutal weather ahead would soon demand far more than $15 from her soul. The 3-mile journey from the fairgrounds back to the homestead was a slow, agonizing crawl through the dust. The rented wagon groaned under the unexpected weight of 300 huddled hens, each jolt of the iron-rimmed wheels sending a ripple of nervous squawking through the wire crates. Abby kept her hands firm on the reins, her mind racing against the setting sun. She knew that bringing these exhausted, featherless birds to Rattlesnake Ridge was only the first half of a fool's gamble. The real trial lay in keeping them alive long enough for the harsh Texas soil to accept them, a truth made painfully clear the moment she pulled into the yard and found Aunt Merle waiting by the chestnut barn. The old woman spat into the dry grass, eyed the stacked crates without a word, and tossed a small leather notebook onto the wagon seat before walking away. On its faded pages, written in her grandfather's hurried hand from 1865, was a single underline: "A spent hen is not dead. She is merely empty. Feed the gut with sour milk and oats, give her clean stone to chew, and keep the dogs away." By morning, 11 birds lay stiff on the floor of the upper barn, their fragile bodies having given out in the crisp autumn chill. Abby buried them near the dry gulch with a heavy heart, her back aching and her thick hands blistered from the spade. The town's laughter echoed in her memory, but she forced herself to focus on the 289 that remained. Following her grandfather's notes like a sacred order, she set to work. She hauled 40-gallon barrels of water from the deep well, her wide shoulders straining against the iron buckets until her breath came in ragged gasps. She mixed whole oats soaked in buttermilk behind the barn, stirring in crushed limestone and wild sunflower seeds. When she unlatched the crate doors to let the flock onto a quarter-acre of fenced pasture, the birds hesitated, blinking at the blinding sky. They had spent their lives on cold wire floors, never knowing the feel of earth. Slowly, instinctively, one hen lowered herself into the dirt beneath an elderberry bush, flapping her ragged wings to coat her bare skin in dust. Within an hour, dozens followed. The first 2 weeks yielded almost nothing, a meager 4 or 5 soft-shelled eggs a day that cracked at the slightest touch. Yet Abby stayed the course, moving the lightweight wooden fencing every 4 days to fresh ground, allowing the hens to scratch for red ants and cedar berries. By the end of the 3rd week, the curve in her grandfather's ledger began to recreate itself. The egg count climbed from 30 to 60 then to a steady 100 a day. More than the quantity, the transformation in the eggs themselves left Abby breathless. The thin, watery, pale shells gave way to thick, speckled calcium, and when she cracked one into her skillet, the yolk sat high and round, glowing with a deep, fiery orange, like a West Texas sunset. Merle ate her Sunday breakfast in silence, put her fork down, and murmured that those were the very eggs her brother used to gather 20 years ago. With the egg production rising, Abby packed 2 cardboard crates into the wagon and drove into Oak Haven, pulling up behind the town's main boarding house and saloon. Joelle Pickard, the sharp-tongued proprietor, cracked one of Abby's eggs into a white ceramic bowl on the kitchen counter. She stared at the vibrant yolk, whipped it with a fork, and looked up at Abby with a keen, calculating eye. Right there on the spot, Joelle offered $4 silver a dozen, nearly triple the price of the flat, pale eggs shipped in by rail, demanding every single egg Abby could produce for her morning thresher breakfasts. The transaction felt like a silent victory, but it did not go unnoticed. At the feed store later that afternoon, Clayton Carver stood by the grain sacks, his tall frame blocking the doorway as he scoffed loud enough for the clerks to hear that a few colorful eggs from old hens were nothing more than a temporary fluke before the birds burned out completely. Abby held her tongue, carried her bag of oyster shell past him, and drove home knowing that argument was useless. The birds would have to deliver her answer. The true test of Abby's resolve arrived in late November when the horizon turned a bruised, unnatural purple. A sudden blue norther hit the panhandle, dragging a monstrous dust storm, a black roller across the open plains. The wind howled through the gulches like a wounded animal, tearing shingles from the roof and driving choking red silt through every seam of the house. While the rest of the county locked their shutters and hid indoors, Abby ran out into the roaring gale. The storm whipped her heavy coat around her legs, blinding her with dust as the outer pasture fences buckled under the wind. The panicked hens were scattering into the dark, terrified by the thunderous gusts. Abby threw her heavy body into the raging wind, ignoring the stinging sand that tore at her face and the deep bruises forming on her knees as she scrambled across the rocks. She grabbed the birds two at a time, cradling their trembling bodies against her chest to shield them from the flying debris. Hour after agonizing hour, she stumbled back and forth between the pasture and the old locust post-laying house, her lungs burning with dirt and her strength nearly depleted. She refused to lose a single life she had fought so hard to reclaim. When she finally dragged the last terrified hen inside and barred the heavy oak door, she collapsed onto the straw-covered floor, surrounded by 300 softly cooing birds. Outside, the storm tore at the valley, but inside the sturdy shelter built by her grandfather decades ago, the flock was safe. As Abby lay in the dark, bruised and exhausted, she felt a profound change settling deep within her chest. She was no longer just a grieving city girl hiding from her past. She was taking root in this unforgiving soil, bound to the land by blood, sweat, and a quiet resilience that no storm could break. December arrived with a cruel, unrelenting frost that locked the Texas panhandle under a sheet of iron ice. The bitter temperatures froze the creeks solid, dragging a harsh drought in their wake that crippled the entire valley. In the crowded industrial poultry barns across the county, disaster struck swiftly. A fierce outbreak of avian flu combined with overcrowded pens and artificial conditions wiped out thousands of commercial birds within weeks. Clayton Carver's massive operation was hit hardest. His fine imported layers perished by the hundreds, leaving his grand chicken houses silent and empty. Oakhaven descended into a severe food crisis as icy mountain snowdrifts blocked the supply trains from the east. The town boarding houses, mining camps, and local hospitals were left entirely without fresh meat or eggs, and the arrogance that had dominated the feed store discussions all autumn evaporated into quiet desperation. Yet up on Rattlesnake Ridge, the 300 hens Abby had saved from the auction thrived against all odds. The ancient laying houses built by her grandfather in 1862 from thick locust posts and chestnut planks held the earth's natural warmth just as Aunt Merle had promised. Every morning at dawn, Abby hauled hot water from the kitchen stove to keep the stock tanks from freezing, her broad shoulders swinging with heavy buckets through the snowdrifts. She mixed extra corn fat and cracked sunflower seeds into the soaked oats, maintaining a rigorous routine that kept the birds warm and active. While the rest of the county suffered in barren silence, Abby's flock continued to lay over 200 deep orange eggs every single day. Her grandfather's ledger notes were proving truer than ever. A bird raised on native soil strength, forged through quiet care, possessed an endurance that no industrial factory could ever replicate. The turning point came on a freezing Tuesday morning when a lone horseman creaked up the snow-covered trail toward the Vance homestead. It was Clayton Carver. His fine leather coat was dusted with frost, his lips blue from the wind, and his proud posture slouched under the weight of sudden ruin. He dismounted heavily by the chestnut barn, standing near the porch where Abby was mending an iron hinge. The silence between them was thick, broken only by the sharp whistle of the winter wind against the ridge. Clayton stared at his boots for a long moment, his former arrogance completely stripped away, before reaching into his coat to pull out a heavy canvas purse filled with silver coin. In a quiet, raspy voice, he explained that the town hospital was full of sick miners, and the hotel had 80 guests with nothing to eat. He offered to buy every egg she had at double her usual price, admitting with a heavy bow of his head that his own flock was dead and his judgment had been utterly wrong. Abby looked at the money, then at the broken man standing in the snow before her. Memory brought back the echo of his cruel laughter at the auction ring when he had mocked her weight and predicted she was merely buying the right to dig 300 holes. A dark impulse whispered in her mind to turn him away, to let him taste the bitterness of his own harsh words. But as she looked across the frozen pasture toward the oak tree where her grandfather rested, she remembered the core philosophy written in those brown cloth-bound ledgers. The ground does not hold grudges, and those who work it must be larger than their anger. She refused his offer of double payment, insisting instead on charging her standard $4 a dozen. She packed 50 dozen eggs into his wagon, telling him to supply the hospital first. Clayton stared at her in stunned silence, a deep flush of shame rising on his weathered neck as he accepted the crates, offering a choked word of gratitude before riding back down the ridge. As winter slowly yielded to the tender green of an early April thaw, a quiet, inevitable sorrow settled over the homestead. Aunt Merle was slowing down. The 79-year-old woman no longer walked up to the upper pastures, preferring to sit on the sunlit porch with her old Colt revolver resting in her lap, watching Abby work with a peaceful, silent approval. One evening, as the setting sun painted the sky in fiery shades of red and gold, Merle looked at Abby and murmured that the farm had finally found the person it had been waiting for, someone who possessed the patience to listen to what the land required. 3 days later, Merle passed away peacefully in her sleep inside her 2-room log cabin. Abby buried her great-aunt on the high ridge beside her grandfather, standing alone in the spring breeze long after the small group of townspeople had departed, her grief quiet and deep, expressed not through loud weeping, but through her commitment to keep the daily work going. While sorting through Merle's belongings the following week, Abby discovered a small cedar box tucked under the floorboards of the cabin. Inside lay a single sheet of lined paper written in Merle's slanted hand, dated months before her death. Reading the faded ink, Abby's heart stopped. Merle revealed that in 1878, when a devastating drought had forced Abby's grandfather to sell off his prized hand-bred flock to Eastern buyers, he had lost a line of birds he had spent 20 years refining for heavy shells and vibrant yolks. When Merle had looked into those wire crates behind the auction barn the previous October, she had recognized the unique speckled feathers and comb shapes immediately. The 300 dying hens Abby had bought for $15 were the direct descendants of her grandfather's lost flock. The gamble had not been a random stroke of luck. It was the closing of a 40-year family circle, brought home by a grieving girl who had been guided by instinct and love. Holding the letter to her chest, Abby walked up to the upper field where the hens were dust bathing under the newly blooming elderberry bushes. The birds were healthy, their feathers full and glossy, their daily yield supplying every diner, hotel, and specialty baker from Oak Haven to the mountain towns beyond. Looking out over the vast Texas valley, Abby realized that her time of surviving was over. She had taken root in this unforgiving soil, just as her grandfather had. Yet, as she watched the flock gather around the feeding troughs, she knew that the future would bring new choices about growth scale and legacy, and that the true measure of what she had built would soon be tested as the years stretched on. 4 years had swept across the panhandle since the damp October morning when an overweight, grieving city girl had raised one trembling finger at the fairgrounds auction. By the autumn of 1892, the Vance homestead on Rattlesnake Ridge had evolved from a forgotten ruin into a quiet legend across the Texas frontier. The laying flock now stood at exactly 600 birds, a number Abby had settled upon after long, careful reflection in her leather journals. She had refused every offer to expand onto Clayton Carver's fertile river-bottom lands, understanding with profound clarity that 600 was the precise limit one person could care for without losing the intimate daily attention that gave her eggs their unmatched quality. Her rule remained written on the first page of her notebook: slow is the product. The transformation of the farm was mirrored in Abby herself. She was still a broad-shouldered, heavy-set woman, but the timid slouch born of city shame had vanished entirely. Her skin was cured to a warm golden brown by 4 seasons of Texas sun. Her hands were calloused and capable, and she moved across the steep limestone pastures with a calm, effortless grace. The townspeople of Oak Haven no longer looked at her with pity or suppressed amusement. When her buckboard wagon rolled down Main Street, shopkeepers and ranchers alike tipped their hats with genuine warmth, recognizing in her the very spirit of endurance that built the West. Caleb Pruitt, the young boy who had helped her load those rusted wire crates on her first day in town, was now 20 years old and employed part-time at the homestead. Under Abby's quiet mentorship, Caleb had learned to read the Sky Mix feed and handle the birds without fear. When he married his high school sweetheart that past spring, Abby had presented him with a starter flock of 50 prime pullets and a hand-built coop as a wedding gift, ensuring that the legacy of patient stewardship would take root in another young family down the valley. Clayton Carver had become a frequent visitor to the ridge, stopping his horse by the upper barn 2 or 3 times a year to share a cup of black coffee on the porch. The old rancher had long abandoned his skepticism, often marveling at how the land had responded to her care. Though he still occasionally teased her about expanding her pastures, it was done now with the gentle affection of an elder brother. The eggs from Rattlesnake Ridge were featured on the menus of premier hotels in Dallas and specialty bakeries as far away as New Orleans, praised in food journals as the finest in the Southwest, an honor Abby found mildly amusing, though she never bothered to put up a sign at her driveway. The original 300 hens, the desperate featherless creatures she had brought home for $15, had mostly lived out their natural lives on the rich pastures, passing away one by one of old age. Abby had buried each of them along the woodline beneath the wild elderberry bushes. Only one remained, a small Rhode Island red with a crooked comb, one of the 49 birds Abby had lifted out of the crates by hand on that first dark night. In the quiet privacy of her own thoughts, Abby called her Old Lady. On a crisp, clear morning in mid-October 1892, the air carried the familiar dry smell of incoming frost, the exact same atmosphere as the morning her journey had begun. Abby stood at the fence of the upper field with a hot mug of coffee resting in her hands, watching a fresh batch of young pullets emerge from the locust post laying house for the first time. They were the great-granddaughters of the original flock, bred from the finest stock, raised on the same rotated pasture, fed the same buttermilk-soaked oats, and watered from the deep limestone well. Old Lady shuffled slowly through the grass beside the new generation, her feathers thick and glossy, her movements unhurried. She found a patch of dry red earth under her favorite elderberry bush, lowered her heavy body into the dust, and let out a low, contented cluck before closing her eyes in the warm autumn sun. Abby watched her for a long time, feeling a quiet, ache-like gratitude settle deep within her chest. She knew that the old hen would not survive the coming winter, but there was no sorrow in the thought, only the peaceful completion of a natural cycle. Abby walked slowly down the slope to the White House. The porch steps no longer creaked under her weight, fixed years ago during her first winter. Inside the sunlit kitchen, she sat down at the heavy oak table where her grandfather had sat decades before. She opened the cloth-bound ledger, dipped her pen into the black ink, and wrote in her even, steady hand, October 14, 1892. 410 eggs collected, weather clear and crisp, stock thriving, ground resting well. She set the pen down, folded Aunt Merle's letter alongside her grandfather's 1865 leather will, and placed them neatly inside the drawer beneath the ledger. She looked out the kitchen window at the sweeping expanse of Rattlesnake Ridge. She had come to this unforgiving country broken, orphaned, and carrying a heavy heart in a body she had been taught to dislike. But the land had not judged her by her appearance or her grief. It had demanded only her patience, her labor, and her willingness to listen. In saving 300 discarded lives, she had inadvertently restored her family's forgotten heritage and rebuilt her own soul from the ground up. Abby stepped back out onto the porch, pulling her wool coat tightly around her shoulders as the morning sun broke over the eastern ridge, bathing the golden pastures in light. There was no sound now except the soft, contented cooing of 600 hens settling into a morning that belonged to them. There was no one left laughing, no point left to prove. The work was done, the circle was closed, and the good ground, as it always does when someone is patient enough to care for it, went on.